I'm giving an expanded version with sparkly new material of the paper I gave at LCT5. So if you were there, you will be getting new stuff. If you weren't there, you'll get the stuff you missed out on and the new stuff. So it's heaps exciting. And the new stuff is very new. So be kind when you ask questions and give me nice suggestions because some of it is a bit, well, it's very fresh, so it could use some thinking through probably. I also want to say that the research project that I'm presenting on here, the analysis for this paper I've done with the LCT, but this is a project that three of us from the university are collaborating on. So I want to acknowledge my collaborators, and that's Amanda Baker and Nolene Weatherby-Fell. Their names are on the slide, and Amanda's here in the audience. Now, I know this is an international audience, and acknowledgement of country is something that we do in Australia, but I decided to leave this in, even though it might be strange to some of you who don't know what this is, because I'm talking about cultural identity. And so I think it's important to have this acknowledgement. So in Australia, we start all our public events acknowledging the traditional Indigenous ownership of the land on which the meeting is taking place. And so I live and wrote the majority of this presentation on the lands of the Bidigal people of the Eora Nation. And they've not only been dispossessed of their lands, but they've largely been displaced by white settlers. Their life expectancy is lower, their health outcomes and educational outcomes are poorer. And so I think it's important to acknowledge the impact of colonisation. And we have a thing that we always say about committing to truth-telling and healing. And I think that's particularly apt given what I'm talking about today. Okay, so the problem and background. What's the problem? What am I talking about today? Essentially, if you boil it right down, the topic is about negotiating cultural identity in a large institution. So, and if my data comes from a university, but this has broader application to just large workplaces in general. If you think about the way we exist in the world, then our understandings of who we are shape the interactions that we have with the people around us. And so Australia is a large multicultural country. We have a long history of immigration in Australia and some pretty shameful treatment of our First Nations people. So cultural identity is a significant issue in Australia. But of course, that is a problem that a lot of you from various other countries will probably recognise in your own situations. So the study I'm talking about today has implications beyond just one place and one time. So I'm really thinking about questions like, who am I? Who are you? What happens when identities clash? And in the institution where this data was collected anyway, we've got low Indigenous participation in the university. We've got about 29% of people whose first language is not English. They were the only stats available in the institution about cultural identity, which is pretty poor. We went looking and that's all we could find. And in that context, where we have a large multicultural nation, long history of immigration, we have a largely white middle-class male senior executive, which is interesting. Now, why now? You might be thinking this problem has been around for a while, the idea of, cultural identities, clashing identities. But I think at the moment it's quite exacerbated because Australian universities are very tense, unhappy places. COVID did a number on us all, and the fallout from COVID is still ongoing. We've had a lot of restructures and workplace change, a lot of retrenchments, a lot of the restructures were pretty brutal in our university and in many others. Then coupled with this narrative of the fact that the university doesn't have any money, we've got very high senior executive salaries. So our Vice-Chancellor is on 1.02 million Australian dollars. We have been negotiating our new enterprise agreement for over a year and a half. It's almost done now. And then in the media, there's been things published like wage theft, so casuals being underpaid, people not being paid for the amount of time it takes to do the work. And there was just a recent report that came out that said there were 97,000 staff who were underpaid by over 30 employers. So there is a big problem at the moment in the universities, and I think that the general climate and unhappiness necessitates more of a focus on things that might seem to address some of these tensions, and one of them could be equity, diversity, and inclusion. So
Erika, can I quick?
Yes.
Sorry,
yes.
it's Karen. Can I quickly ask you a question?
Sure.
Is that public universities?
Yes.
The situation that it's all public universities, so you haven't looked at the private universities as well. Okay.
Nope.
And I just wanted to know, in terms of total number of public universities across Australia?
Oh, I wouldn't have a clue.
Roughly.
Sorry.
Okay.
No.
No,
does anyone else know?
No. You could be reading South African statistics here.
Yeah. Probably. It's probably similar. Yeah.
Around about 42. Okay.
37 public universities.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
No worries.
And Erika's not kidding when she says it's an unhappy place. My university made about $1 billion whilst cutting everything and claiming it's poor.
Oh, sorry. Every time I move my mouse, my slides go crazy. I'll try not to do that too often. So, sorry. I've got to be careful of the scroll mouse. I'm just moving your heads around so that I can see them, but they're not in the way. And please do butt in and ask questions. I have to say, I can talk underwater with the mango in my mouth. So unless you interrupt me, I will just keep talking. If you ask and I don't want to answer it or it's coming, I'll just say I'm getting to that. But I'm very happy to be interrupted and be interactive. Okay, so we've got unhappy universities, wage theft, impacts of COVID, universities saying they've got no money. Then along comes the Vice-Chancellor and says, I'm going to start this inaugural Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Transformation Fund, which sounds great. I like the idea of transformation. And so basically she made available some money for projects that would support EDI. So we didn't actually have a project. This wasn't an idea we had until this money came up. And then we got together. It started off being Amanda's idea. She got the three of us together and said, look, this funding's come out. What do you think about if we do a project looking at cultural equity, diversity and inclusion? And we all went, great. So we didn't have the focus chosen, but we had an opportunity to get some money. So we put together a project, and on the slide, you've got the blurb of what she said the fund is about. And I've just bolded things like safe and respectful, safe and supported, safety and respect, because that was kind of the thrust of the whole point of making the funding available. And basically, spoiler alert, that's exactly what our research found out that is lacking. So there's this, I think they know, the senior executive, that there are problems. And so they chucked a bit of money at it and I think tried to see what would come out in the wash. So specifically today, I'm going to be focusing on cultural identity, and I'm going to present three different perspectives. I'll talk about the data in a minute, but basically what I'm going to give you is 3 differing responses to an interview question. And I'll tell you the question in a minute too, but this is the point of this slide, is to talk about the participants. So I'm going to talk about one male research participant who's very conscious of his privilege and presents identity, the categories that make up identity, as largely taken for granted. And then on the other pole, we've got a female research participant from a minority group who constructs the whole idea of cultural background as highly problematic. And then we've got one in the centre who, that's the new data that I haven't presented on before, who he's kind of in the middle of the two, and he presents his conception of cultural background as quite fluid and a bit like a piece of cultural capital. And the reason I focused on these 3 is because they illustrate the disparate experiences of the individuals across the university. So they really highlight where the tensions are and the differences. And then we've got the whole span between these kind of these 3. So let's get right into the data and the method. We did semi-scripted interviews. So we put out a call to the whole university. We put out several calls. We even got heads of school to approach their faculties as well and ask for volunteers. In the end, we got 13, 7 female, 6 male, age range from 32 to 49, and various cultural backgrounds. We intended for the interviews to be 30 minutes, but we found that a lot of people spoke a lot longer than 30 minutes because they really wanted to speak. They wanted to tell us. The reason why they volunteered for the interview is because they had something to say, a lot of them. And we kept our definition of culture intentionally vague because we wanted to keep it open to however people identified culture. Like, I was thinking to myself, even things like subcultures, like I'm a gamer, I'm a nerd, I'm a whatever. We got largely stuff about socioeconomic background and ethnicity and nationality. I know those concepts are problematic. But so we said that it can mean different things to different people. It could be about language, heritage, tradition, religion, socioeconomic background, etc., etc. But we kept it really broad. Some of the questions we asked, and the one I'm talking about today is there in bold at the top. Can you tell me a little bit about your cultural background? We also asked people if there was much diversity within the groups that they're working in. We asked them whether their cultural background made it easier or harder for them in their work and in what ways. And we asked them what the university was doing well and what the university was doing badly. And we also asked them if they had any suggestions for how the university could do a better job. And we've just drafted, or I should say Amanda has just done a fabulous job of drafting the report to go to the university. Now, I'm only going to be talking about a really small section today, but this is basically, we did the interviews, we transcribed them, we've done a thematic analysis. I've started playing around. I'm also a linguist in another life, so I've been playing around with some systemic functional linguistics analysis. Largely, I've started with appraisal, for those who know, but today I'm just going to be talking about the LCT. So for this presentation, I'm talking about, I'm just doing the same section from 3 interviews, responding to the question, can you tell me a little bit about your cultural background? So we've got a male, 47. He classified himself as just at the end of mid-career researcher. So in Australia, we've got early career researcher, which is up to 5 years post PhD. And then you've got mid-career, which is like 7 or 8 or something. And then after mid-career, you're just, I don't know what they're called, senior researchers or something. And there's often schemes to help early and mid-career researchers to get established, like they might be able to apply for special funding, or there might be training schemes or something. So this guy's just at the end of mid-career, and his response was 143 words. Then the female, she's 42, or was at the time, she's a mid-career researcher. Her response was 476 words, and that original difference is what piqued my interest in the length. And then the third participant is a male. He didn't give us his exact age. He said between 45 to 50. He's an early career researcher. And then I've got his length as 107 plus 101 because he gave a really brief answer at first, and then the assistant who was doing the interview asked a follow-up question, and then he added 101 words, which is interesting in itself. So what LCT concepts did I use? That's driven by the data and the problem. So I'm going to, often in presentations or in publications, you get everything really neatly tied up as though it all kind of emerged, I don't know, beautifully from somewhere. But I find generally analysis to not be like that. So I'm going to uncover some of the messiness for you. So I hope that's okay with you all. We really collected this data because we had an opportunity, and we really didn't know what we were going to find until we started looking. So we had some ideas of what kind of concepts we would use, but that really didn't solidify itself until I started to read through the data. And then once I started to read, look, this is going to sound a bit wanky really, but the data spoke to me. So like some of you may have had this happen to you. You just start reading and things jump out at you and you go, oh my goodness, that's what I have to look at. And that's kind of what happened in this case. Now, I'm only presenting a small snippet of that. The data screamed at me in very loud voices from multiple directions, but I'm just going to present one kind of interesting section of that. The other thing about that is that often you start at something that screams loudly and you sort of go for the most obvious thing, and then you have to kind of backtrack a bit with your analysis and go back and use some different concepts, or go back and forward between the data and the concepts, take a step back and look at something else before you can move forward. So that's the messiness of doing analysis. So the first thing I started thinking of is constellations, because when I started reading about how they identify their cultural identity, I could see these groupings of ideas that kept getting repeated. People kept talking about the same sorts of things with some interesting differences. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I have to do a constellation analysis, because, you know, they were talking about things like cultural identity as being about where you live or what your nationality is or where you were reared, things like that. And then what they did is they then evaluated some of those things. So one participant said, well, ethnicity is really problematic. So they started to group ideas together and they started to attach evaluations to those. So I'm going to show you what they look like a bit later, but I just wanted to kind of put the concepts up there of having, you know, so you have nodes that ideas cluster around, you can charge them with evaluations. And so a constellation then is a group of clusters. And then that was all very well, but I had to go back a bit and think about, well, oh, I'm beeping. I'm going to turn that off. It's probably my daughter. I had to think, okay, constellations of what? Now, I went pretty much to specialization. It's a logical place to go because I'm talking about knowers here. I'm asking them about their cultural background, how they see themselves, how they see their identities. So we know there's always knowledge, there's always knowers, but here there is quite a focus on the knowers and who they think they are. So it seems like an obvious place to go to look at. And then I was thinking, okay, social relations, but how strong? What kinds of social relations are they drawing on? Has identity got to do with where you're born, or has it got to do with kind of how you're socialized, or has it got to do with how you live and take on certain characteristics of a particular culture? And so I started then to start looking at the strength of the social relations. And also this will make sense when you see some of the data, how strong the boundaries are around the categories that they draw on to define themselves, and whether they emphasize these categories or whether they minimize them. And so I'm thinking about things like, you know, whether your identity is something you're born into or whether you can develop it, and whether it's certain or not, and how important different categories are to people. This is the new stuff. I had an aha moment at the LCT conference. I had several. So this is a plug for the next one. If you've never been to an LCT conference, you got to go, because you sit there. I think I made almost as many notes about things I have to look at in my own data than I did about things that people said. And so after LCT, I came away and said, there is something really interesting in my data on focus and basis. And so I've started to play around with that a little bit. So we're talking here about the distinction between what you focus on. It's hard to describe these without using the words. So what practices are about or oriented towards is different to the basis upon which one's practices are legitimate. Okay, so you've got what makes practices legitimate, what is the organising principles underlying practice, and then what are those practices focused on. So that's essentially the difference between focus and basis. And I think there's something really significant going on in my data. So hopefully,
Erika, can I just have another run at that as well? Because this
yes,
is something
please
that a lot of people don't get. So this is particularly important for using specialization concepts, because people often make this fundamental error of trying to code what people are. Let's talk about discourse or text or whatever. People code what people are talking about, and that is not legitimation. And legitimation is in the title of the theoretical framework. So what we're trying to do is what is legitimating? What are the measures of achievement? What are the measures of access and subsets? What are the measures, the sort of hidden messages, the invisible messages, the sort of like almost, like a version of the hidden curriculum. It's like what is being said that may not be explicitly said. And it's not the focus. So you can talk about something and that means nothing. So if I talked about, I'll give you an example. If I talk about a theory and I say this theory is amazing, that tells you nothing. That doesn't mean that's stronger epistemic relations because I'm talking about theory. Because I could say this theory is amazing because the incredibly charismatic Carl Maiden wrote it. Stop laughing. That is emphasizing something to do with the author and Noah. That's a stronger social relation. It's got nothing to do with epistemic relations. Or I could be talking about myself, my experience, my personal experience of, for example, pain, but I might be doing it on the basis of a medical diagnosis. So what we talk about has got nothing to do with specialization analysis. You have to think a bit more broadly about what's the basis of the legitimacy of these claims. And I think this is probably the biggest and deepest and simplest mistake that people make with specialization analysis. It doesn't seem to come up with semantics or autonomy, but for specialization. So sorry to Eric, I just wanted to clarify that because it is something a lot of people get confused about. So if they read that people are talking about something knowledgey, they think it must be stronger epistemic relations, and that is not the case.
Yep. Thanks, Carl.
Can I jump in? Could I jump in as well? Sorry. Just from an autonomy perspective, I always think of focus, and this might be wrong, Carl can tell me, but focus, say it's, I'll just say formative assessment, because that's what I'm looking at. And I imagine, what would that look like in each of the 4 quadrants? Because it's something that's the content, a topic, can be legitimated through various different bases of legitimation. So I try to sketch out, right, well, if that was in sovereign, if that was in introjected, if that was in exotic, this would be what it would look like. I try to vision that kind of space of possibilities, if you like. So what would this topic look like at various different places on the plane? I don't know if that helps, but that's how
that is actually really useful. I do that all the time, which is that you get your data and then think, how else could it be legitimated? How else could be this like justified or valorized? And not just explicitly like this is amazing, but just the fact that it might be in a context, and the context may be giving the basis of legitimation, so that you don't have to say this is amazing because it's beautiful mathematically. It's in a context in which that is part of the basis of what's being judged. So yeah, you imagine how it's being done in different quadrants can be helpful. So this is what I mean, by the way, about being able to jump in and just talk about things, hopefully without derailing the person who's leading it too much. But I hope that didn't derail you, Erika.
No. It's helpful. It's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, you won't derail me much. Just butt in when you want. Okay, now we're going to dive into the responses. I'm going to give them to you just straight how they said them. I'm going to read them to you. One of them is pretty small on the screen, so you might not be able to read it, but I've left it that way intentionally because I just want you to have the visual of the difference between, for example, length and things like that, okay? I may not read it all because it's fairly long, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so participant A says this. Sure. So my father is Irish, my mother is English, and I was reared for the most part in Ireland. So I do just fine. Pretty much here, I pass most of the challenges that are put up by white Australians. And I suppose that's, for me, one of the things that's important, is that what's important is dealing with monolithic whiteness, really, as an identity category, rather than the different kinds of minority cultural identities that are present. Of course, it matters who you are, and you can be discriminated against in different ways depending on who you are. But I've been more or less, my privilege is largely invisible to me, but nonetheless, I get away with things that I have seen other people, including white women, not get away with. And I'll talk about more of that in detail. Okay, the polar opposite I'm suggesting of this is participant P, the female. So she says, well, hard to describe really, because I actually studied culture in my own academic work as well. So I find it quite a fluid concept, and I think it's quite problematic as well. But I think if I was talking to a person like yourself or on the street, and I think what they're probably asking me is, I guess, cultural identity or my sort of cultural belonging, and for a very easy answer, I would say that I'm Taiwanese. That's my sort of my by birth and my cultural identity, and sort of my political identity is Taiwanese. Although I have dual nationality, I'm also a New Zealander. I grew up in New Zealand. We migrated to New Zealand when I was 10 years old, and then I migrated to Australia when I was 23, and I'm married to an Anglo-Australian guy. So I feel like although I'm not an Australian citizen, I live here, I am. And I've also lived overseas. I've lived in England and Germany as well. So and travelled quite a lot, and also did my field work in Papua New Guinea. So I feel like culturally I bring a lot of, not just my main roots, which is Taiwanese, New Zealand and Australia, which is the 3 main countries that I've lived the most time and I identify most with. I sort of feel like I'm very multicultural in that sense. So it's very hard for me to pinpoint down like what my culture is per se. And I think as a public health professional, we often sort of talk about things like ethnicity and race, or sort of cultural and linguistically diverse communities being sort of one of a community that in public health that we study in terms of sort of health disparities and that sort of thing. And so, but I feel like it's very hard to say what ethnicity I am per se, or what race I am, and that sort of stuff. because I find them quite problematic. So yeah, like I find it's actually hard for me to be very precise in terms of my cultural identity if I wanted to dig down into it. But I would say for me, the easiest way to talk about culture is for me to talk about my ethnic background or my Taiwanese culture, because I feel like that's the easiest thing for people to relate to. But then again, I'm also Australian, even though I'm not Australian on paper. And I'm also quite New Zealander, but then I have New Zealand by paper, but I haven't lived there for a long time either. So it's like, it's just complicated. So that's her response. And then the one that I think is sort of in the middle. So the question is, can you tell me a little bit about your cultural background? And he says, anyway, born in the US, but raised by Swiss parents in Switzerland. We were in Switzerland in the US for 5 years, and I've never known why they actually relocated us. Probably because they wanted us to do all the schooling in Switzerland, which is cheaper, less. And I think Dad wanted to get an academic position in the US and never really got a permanent one. And so he gave up and got a job in industry in Switzerland. Then we lived in New Zealand, Japan, lived in Canada, and we've been a decade in Australia now for a decade, so a mix of things. And then the interviewer asked a follow-up question, are there any of those you particularly identify with? And he says, yeah, good question. I like all of them. So I guess it depends where I live and work. It's a hard question because, as you probably know, when you go to Europe, I tend to shift a little bit. I try to accommodate the socio-cultural norm, particularly the German ones, very formal and very stiff to some extent. So you have to readjust. Whereas down here is fairly laid back. And in the States, it's very businesslike in North America. And in Canada, it's very businesslike. So you're kind of sort of fluid in that sense. So that's just an overview of the three. So hopefully that gives you a general feel. Main standouts on initial glance at the data, the length was what got me. Quite distinctly between both the men and the woman. She did a lot of talking. They also all problematise areas of it, but they do it differently. For the females' response, the sort ofs, there were so many sort ofs. I don't know if that stood out for you, but the minute I started reading it, I just started underlining sort of. And there's some kind of, it's almost a bit like indirect apologising in her response. So that's what made me interested. So I started to look a bit deeper. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through each one in turn and just dig a bit deeper into the data. So we're going to start with participant A, and I've called him I Do Just Fine, or I've categorised his approach to his cultural identity that sums up pretty much how he thinks about it, I think. So the first thing I started to think about was what they presented as making up their identity. So this guy really talks about two main concepts, where you live and what your nationality is. So he says his mother's English, his father's Irish. So he links nationality. He doesn't say I am. He tells us what his parents are. And then where he lived, he was reared for the most part in Ireland. He doesn't really evaluate either of these categories, either positive or negatively. He says, I do just fine, but that's really a comment about being white in Australia. He does problematise something, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but generally speaking, he presents these categories as pretty much just so, pretty much unproblematic, and that's encapsulates what he thinks about as his cultural identity. In terms of how strong the NOAA code is, I reckon you could say it's pretty strong. So you don't really have a choice about where your parents are born. It's not something you've got any control over. You're born into the fact that your father's Irish and your mother's English, and reared for the most part. I think it's less strong social relations. You don't have to be born into where you're brought up, but still your parents could rear you in several different places. It's a bit of a process over time. So I think that's...
Can I jump in, Erika?
Yeah, go for it.
I'd say that the first one, my father's Irish, my mother's English, is Because rather than thinking of it in that continuum of strength, I'd say that's like stronger subjective relations. So anything that is based upon a category, doesn't matter what the category is, it doesn't have to be class or nationality or whatever, but if it's emphasizing a category as the basis. So like, you know, I'm English and I'm Australian, or I know because I'm English and Australian, that would be stronger subjective relations. But if I said, I know because I've spent most of my life in England and Australia, that would be interaction relations, because they're setting up some kind of like, I know because of some interactions I have with some significant other of some kind. So I was read for the most part in Ireland is stronger subjective relations. So that would be the difference I'd make. So one is the first one's a social gaze. The second one is a cultivated gaze. X is a social gaze. Y is a cultivated gaze.
Yeah. So I hadn't gone to that level of analysis yet, but I need to.
The Born is a disastrous name. I really wish I could change it, but.
You can see it's kind of towards so they're down the continuum though. So yes, I do need to go there, Carl. So
yeah, no, you're not wrong. You're just like, if we just shifted them over, it would be completely accurate. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't gone into that level of depth yet, but when I get across all the data, I think I'm going to need to go there. So
you don't need to. But the weird thing is that the reason I jumped in is because I didn't use it. I haven't used it in my. I put it into a draft and then I've cut it out. But I made an example for this for just describing different cases that was literally the same as this. I just made it up though. So it's quite funny to see it like actually in real data.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else got anything? Oh, all right, let's keep going. So he presents these categories as what he thinks of his cultural background as the categories are categorical. No, that's bad. They're just so. They're not upscaled or downscaled in any way. They're not blurred. They're just it's pretty unproblematic and pretty cut and dried for him. This will be important for when we look at the next ones. Now we get to the part of the cultural background that he does explicitly problematize. Ethnicity is really the only thing that he includes within cultural identity that he problematizes, and he does it in a way where it's monolithic whiteness that's the problem, not the fact that people belong to minority ethnic groups. Okay, so he says what's important is dealing with monolithic whiteness as an identity category rather than the different kinds of minority cultural identities that are present. So it's not even that he's white that's a problem, it's monolithic whiteness that's a problem. So that's interesting. Now, participant P, I've called her It's Complicated because it's Just Complicated was the name of the paper I gave it at LCT and based on her response. So she has a lot more categories that she talks about when she talks about cultural background. So we've got nationality in light blue, and we've got where you live in dark blue. We've got cultural identity or belonging, which is a category that he didn't talk about, and race. And where he presents his categories as just largely unproblematic, she presents all hers as somehow problematic. They're not necessarily negative, but they're just problematized or incomplete in some way. So, for example, and I haven't presented examples of all of them because there's just not space on the slide, but she says, I'm also quite New Zealander, but then I have New Zealand by paper, but I haven't lived there for a long time either. So she's sort of not sort of. It's kind of like sorry, not sorry. And like it's I'm New Zealander, but I'm not, but I am, but I'm not. So yeah, also what she says about cultural belonging. I feel like culturally I bring a lot of not just my main roots, which is Taiwanese, New Zealand and Australia. Like that's a lot of main roots really, which is the three main countries that I've lived the most time and identify most with. I sort of feel like I'm very multicultural in that sense. So it's quite different in flavour. Then here's this again. So sorry, Carl, there's the born gaze there. We'll just shift. Everyone imagine that it's shifting to the left. But she occupies a much larger space along that continuum is really the point that I want to make, right? She ranges more across it. So she's got where she's born, and then she's got where she grew up, and then she's married to an Australian, and she's lived in places. So she traverses more along that space in terms of what cultural identity means and how what things are legitimate in making up her cultural identity, I guess you could say. So it's not just who your parents are or where you were reared, it's where you've lived, how long you lived there, why you lived there. So she makes a point of saying, I did my field work, or who you're married to, or what your paperwork says are all things that she draws on when she talks about her cultural identity. And she doesn't present any of her categories. None of her categories are categorical. They're all modified in some way. Again, I haven't shown you all of them because there's not enough space on the slide, and I wanted you to be able to sort of at least read some of it, sort of. Every time I say sort of in talking about this data, it sends alarm bells off in my head. So there's even differing degrees of migration with her, right? So she grew up in New Zealand and migrated there when she was 10, but she migrated to Australia only when she was 23. And she lived in England, but she did her field work in Papua New Guinea. So that's a type of living for a type of time, I guess. So she didn't classify, for example, Papua New Guinea as migration, whereas she did Australia and New Zealand was migration, but England wasn't. So there's something going on here in the way that she's modifying all these categories, kind of blurring the boundaries around them, strengthening some, weakening some. And importantly with her, she has an additional node that she links explicitly with cultural background. I've called it this hard to describe. So she explicitly says that her cultural background is hard to describe because it's fluid and problematic and complicated. And then she also modifies the fluid, problematic and complicated. It's quite fluid, it's quite problematic, and it's just complicated. So I think having this explicitly named and all these ideas, and she repeats it several times about how problematic it is. It colours the whole constellation then as somehow problematic or hard to describe, with kind of low-grade negativity.
Erika?
Yes.
Lucy, a quick question.
Yes.
With all the sort ofs, do they pattern in any way?
Don't know. I've started doing some graduation, so appraisal and graduation, so watch this space.
Righto.
Good question. Another way she colours the whole thing, I think, negatively, so sort of, charges up some negative value in there, is by contrasting her perception of what her cultural belonging is with what other people might think about cultural belonging. So, and she does that really close to the beginning of her bit that she's talking about. So, and because it's close to the beginning, I think it colours the whole, her whole answer with kind of like low-grade negativity. So on the screen there, what you've got is the cluster around her conception of her cultural identity or belonging. So she talks about her main roots as being New Zealand, Australia, and Taiwanese. And Taiwanese is further expanded by, like, she's Taiwanese by birth and she's Taiwanese by political identity. But then what she does is she contrasts that with what other people might be asking for. And I see your hand, Jennifer, and I'll finish talking and then I'll get to you. So she then says, well, but what other people might be asking for, if I was talking to a person like yourself on the street, I think what they're probably asking me is, I guess, my cultural identity or my sort of cultural belonging, and for a very easy answer. So I would say I'm Taiwanese. that's my sort of by birth, my cultural identity, and my political identity. So she says she basically imagines what other people might be thinking of, says, well, that's less complicated. That's a very easy answer. And I think that's low grade negative, especially when you contrast it to what she says in her first sentence, which is it's very hard to describe and it's fluid. So she's setting up this contrast between fluid, problematic, and very easy answer. Jennifer.
Hi, thank you, Erika. This is really fascinating. The thing that strikes me particularly about this person is the way that they envisage cultural belonging as either. She seems to envisage it as being a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this and a little bit
you're
of that,
stealing my thunder.
Like a jigsaw puzzle, whereas you could see it as a Taiwanese layer and a New Zealand layer and an Australian layer that all completely her.
Yep, you're stealing my thunder, so hold that thought.
Sorry.
That's all right. That means I must have got it right.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about that. So yeah, I think so too. I said, all right, let's go to M, because we'll get to that interesting bit that Jennifer's just has seen in the data. So participant M, I like all of them. That's what I'm categorising him as. So his constellation's a little bit different to the others. He still has the cluster around where you live, but he fills that out more. So he talks about places he's lived, but he also sort of had these categories of living, like where you work, where you were raised, and where you did your schooling. So they're all parts of where you live. And then he's got where you're born. And he also talks about sociocultural norms, interestingly, which the others don't do. So that's interesting. So again, shift to the left, the line. I've put this born in the US in brackets because I don't think he actually really identifies much with that. He says he mentions he's born in the US, but then he spends the rest of the time talking mostly about more social and cultivated types of things, like where he was raised, where he went to school, and his cultural belonging. So he does mention it as important, but he kind of brackets it off and then goes on to talk more about other things. So he occupies more of the space along that continuum than the first guy, but less than the female participant does. And with regards to how categorical his categories are, a lot of them are modified in some way. And like I said, what I found most interesting is he kind of discounts the where you're born part. So he says, I was born in the US, but, and then goes on to talk about the rest of it. He does qualify where you live with amount of time, like P does. So there seems to be this thing about how long you live in somewhere has more to do with how much it makes up your identity. So he says he lived in the US for 5 years, but he's lived in Australia for a decade now. So they seem to be significant because of length of time. And he also upscales all the socio-cultural norms by saying, well, Germans are very formal and very stiff, but the Australians are fairly laid back, and the US and Canada is very businesslike. And cultural background isn't really problematized with him. So he does say it's a hard question, but that's not really because cultural identity is necessarily hard. It's in response to the interviewer's question, are there any of those countries that you particularly identify with? And he says, yeah, good question. I like all of them. So I guess it depends where I live and work. It's a hard question because, as you probably know, when you go to Europe, you tend to shift a bit. So it's more like, well, I can't really say I identify most with one country or another because I like all of them. So he doesn't really preference them. It's really, for him, got more to do with where he's living at the time. Okay, I'm going to do a little summary of similarities and differences, and then I'm going to get to the focus and basis stuff. So we've still got about half an hour. If you're falling asleep, feel free to turn your camera off and jump around or lie on the floor or something and just keep listening. So in summary, it's complicated. I love the fact that she said it's just complicated, because now I can use it all the time. So I've kind of tried to color code here similarities and differences in their conceptions of cultural identity. So they've got largely similar categories for the most part. There are some differences, but they're fairly consistent. And in fact, you can see some level of consistency across the data set with interesting differences. But they've got different reasons for and degrees of connection with the categories that they think makes up identity. So I think that signals the different legitimacy in their mind of certain ideas or concepts or practices. By what basis are you, hopefully I've used it right and Carl's not going to shoot me. What is the basis upon which you can say that you are one culture or another? Is it how long you live there, or is it what you've got on paper, or is it that you're married to an Australian guy, for example? Another similarity is that all three mention problems or difficulty, but the difference is that what they identify as problematic or difficult varies between the participants. So A presents membership of particular ethnic groupings as problematic only because of their treatment by the white brain fog's gone away, monolithic whiteness. But the others don't talk about that really. All three are able to identify categories that make up their cultural identity, but A presents it as relatively straightforward, whereas both P and M don't. P and M both blur the boundaries, but A doesn't. But the boundaries are blurred in different ways. And here's where I think we're getting to what Jennifer was talking about before. I'm sort of, again, this is new kind of fresh thoughts out of my brain, but I think A presents himself as fairly monocultural. P presents herself, I think, as culturally plural. So she's got like these categories. And she says the word fluid, but she doesn't talk about it like it's fluid. She talks about it like they're, like Jennifer said, puzzle pieces, or I was thinking boxes. Whereas, so I would call A's conception monocultural, P culturally plural, and M, I reckon, culturally fluid. I think that's kind of the way he presents it. Both P and M draw explicit attention to the complexity of cultural identity, but P views the complexity as a problem. It's problematic in some way, or the concept is problematic. M doesn't have a problem with it. It's fluid, and that's fine. The only problem he has is in being not fluid. P does a lot of talking to make her point. And I've put there in indirect apologizing with a question mark, because it seems like she's got a lot of convincing and all the sort ofs. There's something going on. P and M are far more succinct. In fact, M was so succinct that he had to be asked to talk more. Now, here's where we get on the new stuff and the shaky ground. I think the basis of their cultural identity is similar in terms of, the categories that they think are important. But the way they focus their cultural identity, or the way that cultural identity is a focus, I'm not quite sure what it is, or if it's both, is different. And I've got, so just one slide on each participant starting to play around with this idea. And this is the bit that's undercooked, but I think is really interesting to look around with. So I've only just started playing with this in the last week. It was one of the, I drew a big light bulb in my journal at LCT5 and said, there's something going on with focus and basis. Go home and look at it. So there you can go. There's my light bulb. So this is new. So I think with the basis of what a legitimate cultural background is, your parents' nationalities, the place of upbringing, and race, they're the things he kind of mentioned. So they're the little bubbles in the diagram, the little circles. But what does he do with cultural identity? He uses it to question privilege. So he says things like, what's important is dealing with monolithic whiteness. And he says things like, I've been more or less, my privilege is largely invisible to me. I mean, the fact that he can say it means it isn't, but nonetheless, I get away with things that I've seen other people, including white women, not get away with. So this idea of cultural background to him is useful in some way in questioning privilege. And that's what he focuses on to do with this whole question. Whereas P, so her basis of what her cultural background is, so she's got her place of birth, she's got her place of upbringing, she's got where she lived, she's got race, she's got who you're married to. But what her focus of this question about culture, I think, has got to do with academic culture. So she talks about how she studied it as an object of study in her own academic work. And so it's a fluid and problematic concept, and that's what we learn by our academic study in this area. And she talks about her role as a public health professional, where they focus in on things like ethnicity or race or cultural and linguistic diversity as being problems for public health problems. So for her, I think cultural background is focused on academic study in health, social problems, perhaps, that kind of thing. Whereas for M, he's got similar basis for what makes up his cultural identity, place of birth, parents' nationalities, place of upbringing, where you lived. But his focus is on enacting his cultural identity. So he says, talks about how he shifts depending on where he is. You have to readjust. So for him, it's about enacting a certain identity. And that's as far as I've got with the focus basis thing. But there's more work, I think, to do there. And I think there's something really interesting going on there that underlies what I was sort of having the feels about the differences in how they're talking and things like that.
Erika,
okay,
if you just go back a slide, one more. The stuff on the right hand side at the top there is you can analyze for its basis as well. Because focus and basis isn't separate empirical data. It's like the same empirical data, just seen in two different ways.
Yep.
So you could say she's talking about that stuff, but you could also say this is some of the basis on which she's claiming, what she's saying to be legitimate. Yes. I studied it in my academic work.
Yes.
So
therefore I'm
and as a public
knower.
Health professional, like she's getting it in everywhere. Like I've done it in my own academic work, which is a sort of interaction relations, that's cultivated case. As a public health professional, that's another subject. That's another social gaze. So it's like she's getting all the gazes in, I think.
Yeah.
Or she's adding quite a lot in. But yeah, I'm just saying you can analyze that stuff on the right as basis as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thanks, Carl. That's helpful. Actually, you're right. She traverses a lot of ground. All of it, as much of it as she can.
I think she might be she's covering all the bases, actually, in a way. She's getting all the cases in.
Yeah.
Thomas has said something in chat. Do you want to say it, Thomas? Because Erika,
Yeah,
can't
sure,
be
no
the
worries.
same.
No, that's fine. It's been fascinating. When I'm listening and watching your talk though, Erica, I'm reminded of a lot of the work I'm familiar with, not so much now, but in cultural studies and race theory and identity. And a lot of what you're saying about boxes of identity or performative identities, I'm like, yeah, okay, Judith Butler, yeah. It reminds me of some of the readings I've been doing um, with uh, ethnographic work with teachers here in Japan, and not to criticize or disparage what you're doing, because I think looking at it through specialization is incredibly valuable. But I do hope you're going to be in dialogue with that work, because a lot of what you're finding boxes of identity, performative identities, these are the exact same things that people in those fields have been looking at for decades now, I think. So just have a look if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing your dialogue if you have. So sorry.
Yeah, look, haven't gone there yet because I do linguistic analysis of text, and I'm not from that background. So and you know what my background is, Thomas. So if you could send me a list of things that I should read, that would be awesome. Because
Okay, I'll see if I can find there, because there's an absolute heap. But
And if you could translate Judith Butler into English, that would be helpful.
I don't think anyone's quite done that yet.
I mean, I don't think I necessarily. I mean, it would be interesting to, and at some stage I will go there. I don't think it's critical to read that stuff to be able to analyze this, because, and I'll get to that actually in one of my final slides, which I'm kind of going to in a minute. But in a sense, I'm analyzing what they say, and at this point, I'm interested in presenting what they say about who they are and what these things mean. And so I think that's legitimate, just from that basis. Now, then if we want to push it further and say, okay, socially, how can we theorize this and things like that? I mean, LCT does give us enough to talk about knowledge and knowers, knower gazers, that kind of stuff, and legitimation codes, which I think gets us some way. The problem is that if I go to that literature, first it'll be, well, you're not from this like theory, so why are you talking about this anyway? And then everyone will just fight over their pet theoretical ways of seeing things, and then you'll get the kind of standpoint theory and stuff coming in. So like, I agree with you that we need to engage with that kind of literature, but in a way I kind of don't want to go there because it opens a bit of a can of worms.
I'm not entirely sure that that's true for all of that literature, and I totally agree with you that LCT and the linguistic and your basis and SFL work that you'll be bringing into this, no doubt, is more than sufficient for the analysis. I'm thinking more in terms of what you would put in sort of a literature review and what might go into the discussion and how you can connect things. I think there are perhaps theorists and researchers in that field that are less combative as what you're saying, although I do see where you're coming from. I do know why you're thinking that, and yeah, I'll see if I can put some stuff together for you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, because I want to write this up. We want to write this up, and there's so much data and it's so rich, and so I do need to be across, and I'm just totally not, because it's completely outside of my area of expertise. So yeah, if you send me a reading list, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I just think like a reviewer. I mean, you know how it is as a reviewer. I'm thinking a reviewer is going to read this and be like, wait a minute, this is identity theory. This is critical theory. Why isn't she talking about these people? That's basically where I'm coming from.
And I also need to engage with that literature to say I'm not coming at this from identity theory or critical theory or whatever. However, these ideas, of course, intersect, right? So yes, that's important.
That's a really good point, Erika. I mean, I know it's not exactly on your topic, but it is a really good thing sometimes to be able to engage with some other literature a little bit and say, so that to be able to say, they're doing that over there and I'm doing this over here, so that people don't mistakenly come in and say, why didn't you use the theory that I like?
That's right.
Because I'm doing something different, which is complementary perhaps, but the nature of that complementarity might be beyond the 7,000 words, including references that I have. That I have in this paper.
Now we've got 15 minutes, and I want to get to my final slide. So I'm gonna, if anyone wants to ask a question, perhaps I might make you wait till the end. All right, my arrow keys are not working now. Why not? That's why. Okay, so what? Big deal. Really interesting, constellation gazers, yada, yada. They're all different. Whoop-de-doo. Well, I've got a couple of so what. So the first one is to do with equity and diversity and inclusion of what. So our larger project was looking at supports and barriers to cultural equity, diversity and inclusion. But what's culture? Like we don't even know. And talking to 3 different people, you get 3 different answers. So I think the first step is understanding it. You can't really support cultural diversity if you don't know what it is. And a lot of our participants in the study, like the larger data, are quite depressing. And so a lot of our participants complain about lip service, monocultural leadership. So I think listening is really important. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but if different knowers have different conceptions of who may know, on what basis one may know, it's not visible unless we make it visible, and we can make it visible through analysing what people say, presenting it visually, doing papers like this. So, I mean, the potential for clashing codes is huge. And so the more of this kind of analysis and talking we can do, the more we can uncover where clashes could come up and think about what we do about that. My second so what, and this is a new so what, thinking about focusy, basisy things, is culture is more than just who you are. I know this, I mean, it's kind of obvious when I say it out loud, but I think it needs to be said out loud that culture is more than just who you are. It's what you do, and it's also, it's not just what you do, but it's what you do with your culture. So, I mean, this is a big question. It's like, what is the meaning of life? What is culture actually for? What do we do with it? So, is it about seeking social justice or challenging injustice? Is it a topic for academic study? Is it a matter of health? Is it about fitting in? Is it about how social cohesion or how things work in different contexts? And there was a question, I was just scrolling through the chat before, someone asked about if this was just, where is it? Sorry. About teaching identity over research, or was it aimed at those on research contracts? So this was, most of this was what we call 40-40-20 academics, so people employed as both teaching and research and with governance roles. But we didn't focus on, and they were all academics, not professional staff. We didn't focus in specifically on questions to do with teaching or research, but they talked about, in their broader talking, when we asked them whether their cultural identity made it easier or harder for them in the workplace, they talked about both teaching and about research, actually. But that's another paper for another, like other data for another paper, right? I'm just talking about how they describe their cultural identity, not their teaching or their research here. That's a whole, we've got data on that too. That's just an aside, sorry. But so, yeah, so I was thinking about, okay, so first, we don't understand what culture is. Secondly, we don't, like, they've got different conceptions of what it's for. And I've said there, is it a form of cultural capital? Like, I think the answer is yes, obviously, but anyway, there's more kind of questions than I have answers for today. And my third so what is around the idea that LCT can do anything, which Carl always says, and I am being the fangirl here. One thing that I think...
Oh, there are many things it can't do, Erika.
Oh, well, okay.
LCT cannot hug you asleep at night.
No, that's true. Okay, it can't cure my overwork issues, but
oh, hang on, I could do that probably.
Yeah, maybe. But what I think its use in this data is that it can, in a way, depersonalize data that's deeply personal. So you can take what someone says and you can analyze their words and see the way that they talk about, and then look at what underlies that. So this research is about knowers, but we need a way to talk about knowers that gets beyond talking about your experience, just your experience and just my experience, because otherwise it's just stuck in just your experience and just my experience, and we can't get past that. So we need to get beyond. We had a lot of problems when we were asking for this funding in people saying, well, you can't research cultural identity because you're 3 white women. And we said, yeah, but we've all lived in different countries. We're all TESOL, well, 2 of us are TESOL educators. I've worked with marginalised, disenfranchised, started off as a school teacher, young people teaching refugees, and I've worked with international students my whole career. You can't tell me that I don't have enough knowledge to be able to ask people in these categories to tell me their stories. And so I think, you know, I mean, we had an advisory group. We passed our questions by a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds, including Indigenous Australians. But I think we need to be able to do research in such a way that we can research things that aren't directly us. Do you know what I mean? I'm blathering a bit, but this is a big issue, this issue of you can't research it if you're not. So we need to get beyond standpoint theory, really, I think, and LCT can help do that, because we're looking at these people, they've said their things about themselves in their own words, and what we're looking at is then in what underlies how they conceptualize themselves. So I think that LCT has huge potential to be able to get beyond the talking about knowers, getting beyond just the individuals being the only ones that are qualified to say anything. And that's where I'm going to stop. We've got 10 minutes left.
Thomas had his hand up first.
Who had their hand up first?
Thomas put his
Well,
mic on.
I've already spoken, so I could
right.
someone else can ask first.
I quickly want to jump in, Erika. I mean, so one, I've had multiple like ta-da moments here. In our context, is Monel still? Yes, Monel is still here. So in the South African context and the Stellenbosch University context specifically, we are currently conducting a whole institution-wide project on our term for it is transformation. And last year I was the external researcher that they hired, and I thought, okay, hang on a moment, what do you mean when you say transformation? And I did a kind of a quick and dirty, which ended up in a report, a global perspective. And what struck me, first of all, the Aussies, well done, you guys, are first here, along with the Canadians, in terms of tackling, very often from the health sector, Indigenous population health outcomes, the disparities in health outcomes. So the first thing that struck me was, from a focus basis perspective, is in Asia, for example, in that literature, focus was on social harmony. The underpinning basis was something else, or vice versa. But the point is, we're all calling these things different things. So diversity, equity, inclusion, transformation, cultural competence, a whole lot of things, democratic citizenship, the whole EU, you know. So it gave me beautiful, insight into, hang on, exactly what you've said. We're not necessarily understanding this, what we mean by it, but the question is, what do we want to do with it? So I really liked your closing on it's what we do with that. And we know the cultural capital, all the capital related arguments. But what struck me as you were going through your participants is that actually gazes, I saw it in a whole new way. If you take a code shifting perspective, you talked about fluid, being fluid. And because of my work with epistemic relations and the ability to shift, recognize what kind of knowledge is necessary where, I think is parallel to what you were talking about, but where the empowerment lies in code shifting when you're identifying as what and what practices you are engaging with in terms of what you're recognizing. So the same issue of born in South Africa, first generation, German entire upbringing, but cultivated gaze in XYZ. And I'm just saying, it's like James G's concept of big D discourse, mush making, adopting the practices. And the feedback here is, I think you're onto something with using gazes as a way for people to unpack, even from a quadrant perspective, what they identify with trained, cultivated, born or social gazes, and how they engage in the practices that they identify that are associated with how their perspective on that gaze and how they move between them. And I just, that was for me a big moment about the fluidity of that. And there's the complexity. Therein lies the complexity. That's just feedback.
Thanks. I'm glad it's speaking to people.
Stunned silence. Somebody say something. Nati's about to talk.
Just jump in. Just jump in, please.
Just jump in. I'm jumping. Tried to restrain myself. But the thing that strikes me is that working on the TESOL course at UNE, one of the resources we give the students is a TED talk on the monolingual mindset. And you can also have a monocultural mindset. And anybody who looked at you and went, oh, you're just a white woman, did they not look at your name and realise there may be a few layers there? How stupid. And these people that you have interviewed all have multiple layers to their culture. And that makes their background and their understanding this fluidity so much richer. And that bringing that out and making it clear and visible, I think, is so important, because a lot of people look like just white women, but there's a lot more to us.
Yeah. Amen,
Or
sister.
just white men, whatever.
Erika,
Yes.
thanks so much. I saw your LCT5 presentation, and it was so lovely to come back and see, how you've developed and moved things on. And so that's really been awesome. What I just wanted to tell you, so one of the things that I'm going to be teaching in the next semester is on teacher identity. And, I really want to steer away from the way that it's been done in the past. And I think that, to kind of start with some of the questions that you asked in terms of, how do you describe your cultural identity, and how difficult or how easy is it to enact your practices, or just those questions that you had developed. I was really, it started getting my mind thinking about, how we could start our teaching unit with some of those kind of questions modified for our context and our purpose, and then kind of take it from there, and give them some sort of ideas of gazes and how they recruit different gazes, develop different gazes, and work within a whole kind of intersection of those gauges. So thanks very much. Appreciate that.
I think that'd be excellent. And one thing I didn't say, so I've got a slide on the end, is the team's expertise. So I'm working with Nolene Weatherby-Fell, who's here. Hi, Nolene. She works on teacher resilience, and Amanda Baker works on teacher cognition, among other things, pronunciation, pedagogy. And so that's why this work is so interesting to all of us, because, you've got teacher resilience, you've got teacher cognition, you've got LCT and SFL areas. We can all look at teacher identity from different perspectives. And so, watch this space, because there'll be more coming out from different theoretical perspectives, but all kind of getting at this similar question from a different angle. So yeah, I'm glad it sparked something in your brain too. Any other questions or comments? Thanks everyone for coming.
Anybody can join, jump in, talk, just speak.
Can I just ask, so I put this in the chat, but it was all about countries, of country of birth, country you lived. And I'm a monolithic white person who's never lived anywhere but England. But if you asked me about my culture and made me think about it, I would do the same kind of fluid thing, I think, because I was born in a county where you really care about where you were born, but I lived somewhere else over the border. I went to Oxbridge to be educated, but now I think of myself as a Londoner, and I hate the idea that I have to be classed as English, because Londoners are multicultural and more, and really nice, and English people are really horrible in the way that it's developed over here. I'd love to be Welsh if only I could find some link to allow me, because I support the Welsh rugby more than I support any other kind of rugby. And sometimes I'll even refer to the fact that I'm Norman, just to kind of get across that I am an immigrant, because we came over with William the Conqueror, which is getting very, very extreme. But all of yours were about countries. I wondered, was that throughout all of it? Is that something about Australia, that everybody comes from all over the place? And or do people go fluid down at this sort of smaller level below being monolithic white?
I mean, so there's several things. Small studies, so we only got 13 participants. Most of them so we do have quite a large multicultural population. Having said that, I think people define, generally, and I could be just talking, rubbish, but I think people generally define culture as having to do with nationality in some way, or countries, where different countries. So we did have a couple of one participant said they didn't really have a culture, which I also found interesting. And a few people talked about socioeconomic status, but most people, it was to do with country of origin. Now, that might just be because we had culture in the title and people assumed that culture meant countries. I don't know. I was actually surprised at the focus throughout the data on countries. I thought maybe we need to use words like subculture or something. I don't actually know. But yeah, it seemed to be that's how participants defined culture, generally speaking, as countries.
The other thing, I just saw Thomas saying, like, people have no culture. My son's just been battling with this, because my children's school have culture days when you're supposed to kind of celebrate your culture, and he kind of worries about this, but he decided this week that his culture is the fact that he likes sort of hats with cows on, and that's what makes him different. His culture is he wears hats. That's what everybody knows him about.
I mean, when I grew up, being cultured was listening to classical music and knowing how to use your cutlery properly from the outside in, or whatever, So
yeah.
You had cutlery.
Yeah.
You were lucky.
No, we didn't live in a gravel hole in the middle of the road, and
I think it's a really good point that it is. Some of it might be set up by the way in which the project is presented, and also the fact that Australia, we do tend to say that over here, which is, what's your background or what's your heritage, and it would normally be a list of countries, or in my case, one. Whereas when I was in England, it would be, if I was asked these questions, I would have been talking about my social class background. Very much, potentially where I came from in the south or north, or Midlands, but mostly it would have been about, working class, middle class, that sort of stuff. But in Australia, it does have a tendency, I find, this is just anecdotal, but I think it would be a bit more that way, national. The words would be more often based on what sounds like country, but is really, I think, talking about the culture of the country. Not just being born there, but the way in which they construct it's interesting. If they're saying, like, I was born in such and such, it's not the same as, if I say I was born in England, it doesn't quite mean the same as I am English.
No, and he didn't say I am Irish, or I'm English. He said My mother was English, my father was Irish or whatever, and I was reared for the most part in Ireland. So he didn't actually say what he was like. What are you? He didn't say. It's interesting. I mean, just for myself, if someone asks, I was born in Australia, my nationality is Australian, but my dad was German. Depends on what point I want to make, what I say. So I'm a bit like participant M, right? Sometimes I say I'm German. I'm actually not. I mean, I have German heritage, but I guess culturally speaking, I am very German. Like we eat a lot of German food. I go full German at Christmas, the whole thing. So it is interesting how we talk about it. But we do also talk about subcultures a lot in Australia, especially with youth. So I reckon if you went and talked to, say, a 16-year-old on the street in a skate park, you might get a completely different answer. We also, I would like to say, we also want to expand this research. So this was obviously a small data set. The idea was to get more funding and to do a not just university-wide, but in several other universities, anonymous survey, because we had a few participants who said they would like to participate, but they felt threatened, not by us, but by the institution. They felt worried that they wanted to be anonymous, and you can't be anonymous in an interview. The person at least who interviews, and the other thing is that people were worried because, like, we had several participants say, I can be identified by what I say because I say this loudly and publicly a lot, and so if people are reading these data, they'll know that it was me. So there was that problem as well, which is hard to get around. So we really would like to do a larger survey that would capture more data, and perhaps some of these questions would be answered, but at the moment we don't have the money for it. So watch this space. Maybe when we put our report into the powers that be, they'll throw some more at us.